Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my worm arena. I've got some worm bins that need to be tended to. I bought some food down here. It's a whole variety of different mixed veggies and fruits. Stuff that's been frozen. So as it thaws, it's going to kick out a lot of moisture, and by having been frozen, it should make it nice and gooey and easy for the worms to eat. I've also got some other stuff down here, including a bunch of coffee inside of this carton, as well as some coffee filters that we're going to use as bedding. And I've also got some pulverized eggshell here in this jar. We're going to use that as grit. And a lot of times I'll come down here with my little board full of stats and information and stuff about what we're going to be doing today. And I had all the worm bins listed, their ages, how many feedings they've received. And then I went ahead and I hit the button and I deleted the whole thing. So, oops, none of that interesting information today. I'll see if I can remember some of it at least. So the first bin we're going to be working on is one that's not being fed actually. It's one that hasn't been fed now for 22 days. And if memory serves me correctly, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 113 days of age. And the whole idea of it not getting any food for the past 22 days is that it's in a process that I refer to nowadays as foraging, something I used to consider as the starving phase. The whole idea is that, a lot of worm bins have all kinds of scraps of leftover food and bedding and everything in there. So I've been wanting to give those worms a chance to really work down that material nicely, so that at some point I can give them food again, but at that point the food is going to be to lure them out of the finished compost so I can collect them all up, harvest the castings, and start a new worm bin. So that's the first bin we're going to check, and then I've got 3 other bins here today. And yeah, it's not a lot of food, so I'm probably not going to be very generous with the food. There's coffee too, which also counts as food. And those bins are varying ages at this point. I can't remember what they were anymore. Maybe 80 something days old, maybe 40 something days old. The last bin is only 13 days old, and it's only received a couple of feedings. And that bin is actually a mixed bag of a variety of different worms in it. And I'm curious to see how that bin's doing. Oh yeah, and that second to youngest bin that we're going to be feeding is also an interesting one because it's got such a huge population in it, so that's always fun to check in on. So I'm going to move this stuff aside, get the first bin out here, get a glove on, and then we can start feeding. Let's get to work. Now here in this foraging bin, as I call it, I'm just awaiting that day when I look in here and I find no scraps of bedding, no scraps of food, no nothing. And then I'm really happy with the material in the bin, such that I can just consider it all as just a container full of finished compost. And then they're going to start getting fresh food again. But it'll just be over on the very edge of the container. And the whole idea there is going to be that the worms are going to be lured out of the finished compost, abandoning the compost, so that it can be harvested. And the last time we checked in was 8 days ago, and something I had done 8 days ago was an attempt to try to help this bin reach the finish line a little bit more quickly. And that was to pick through the material and try to remove all these large leaves, which included their stems. And I did manage to pluck a good number of that material, and I did manage to pull a whole bunch of that stuff out, but obviously there's still a good amount of it remaining in here. And, I'm not going to go crazy. I'm not going to go trying to do that again. It was just that I had placed a whole bunch of very large, beautiful, colorful autumn leaves into this container as bedding at one point. And then it seemed like those leaves were going to take forever to break down. So I did try to extract a good number of them, but I wouldn't be surprised if some of them remained. It does kind of make me feel like I should try to pull some of them out if I encounter them, because stuff like this, these sticks are not going to get done anytime soon. So whatever, maybe we'll just create a little pile of large chunks of material if we encounter them. We could set them aside and include them in one of the newer bins where they'll have plenty of time to break down. And then the worms can really focus their energy on the small, minute particles in here that are not worth trying to fish out. So, there's bits of paper, bits of leaves, all kinds of different materials in here that you know, given enough time, the worms will consume it all. And you know, I mean, if I think about it, now that I look through here and I see that there is a good number of worms in here, it does seem like, you know, a couple scraps of material like this probably isn't going to take that long for this many worms to be able to break down. So maybe I'm just wasting my time by trying to get that nitpicky here and pull out all that stuff. Maybe I'll just let nature take its course. I'm not in a particular hurry to try to get this bin migrating, because that would be the next phase, as I would consider it. After this foraging kind of starving phase winds down and I'm satisfied that all this small particle material has all been thoroughly broken down, it'll be at that point I'll just, you know, push all the material off to the side like this, and then I'll set up a nice fresh load of bedding on the far edge, and then the worms will be highly motivated at that point to go run over there and take advantage of all that fresh bedding, fresh food, and then they'll abandon all of this beautiful compost so that I can simply scoop it out and harvest it with minimal effort. So yeah, maybe it's just a quick check-in to see how things are progressing in here. Make sure there's no real significant issues. Doesn't hurt once in a while to check in. I mean, you know, 8 days, who knows what can happen in 8 days. I'd rather just stay on top of it. It also kind of gives me peace of mind that things are in fact going the direction I'm hoping that they'll go. And this worm bin does have a good number of worms in it too, so it is kind of fun to pick through here and see them all spread out all over the place, working the material down, pretty much not concentrated in any one place, since there's been no concentrated feedings added to this bin for 3 weeks plus. So the worms are just making their way throughout the entire container, picking off anything they can find on the way. And that's exactly what I had intended for them to do at this point. So, you know, here's more of these large leaves that I had done a pretty good job pulling a large number of them out last time we were in here 8 days ago. But, yeah, like I said before, I'm not going to bother with it today. I just want to take a quick look, see how things are progressing in here. I didn't really expect to find no scraps at this point. But, you know, I think in due time we'll get there. And at that point we will set this whole thing up for migration and try to migrate the worms out of the finished compost. But that process will always work best if all of this is really heavily broken down and there's very little, you know, food scraps left for them to eat anymore. So let's get this thing covered back up. I think the moisture level's pretty good. I can feel, you know, a little stickiness, a little dampness. The stuff is sticking to my glove a little bit. It may be a little bit more damp than it needs to be right now, but I'm not going to complain about it, because I know that that's an environment that, you know, promotes a lot of happy worms. It keeps a lot of worms, a lot of worms really active in all areas of the bin, doing the job that I want them to do. So I think I'll give this bin a nice big fat thumbs up, because it's definitely progressing as I had hoped it to be at this stage. And then we'll just see what we can pull off in terms of a nice quick migration out of the compost when the time comes to do so. Sometimes I'm really fascinated at how quickly the worms are willing to exit some really heavily broken down material if you motivate them with some really nice bedding and fresh food. You know, within a couple weeks they could be completely out of the finished compost. So let's move on to the next bin, and there we will be feeding. So let's get over there now. Alright, so in this bin we're going to see that there are no plastic coverings, and that would be an indication that the bin had been running a little bit overly damp. So we left off the plastic coverings to allow for a little bit of moisture to do its evaporation and allow the material in the bin to dry off a little bit. And we can definitely tell that this material on the top is quite dry. You can hear how crumbly it is as I try to move it off to the side. And it's not surprising. This is the kind of leaves that were pulled out of the bin that we just checked in on. There was a whole bunch of it. So it's not so much the paper I wanted to have dry off, it was the material in the bin that I wanted to dry off because it was probably a little bit too muddy, a little bit too damp. So I'm curious to see how it's progressing from that point of view. It's got a nice dampness to it. I'm sure the worms enjoy it. I would not say that it's overly damp. Maybe just a little bit overly damp, but not bad. I think if it had gotten to the point where I was already deciding that it's time to remove the plastic coverings, it might have already had, you know, standing water at the bottom, and it may have been like extremely muddy and getting all over my hands when I was in here working on the bin. So so it is pretty decent. Stuff flakes and moves around pretty good. Doesn't really clump up, and it's not too muddy, but still probably a little more damp than it needs to be. I could certainly see keeping the moisture evaporating and keeping the coverings off when we're finished here feeding. So I've pretty much decided already on how we're going to put the bin back up on the shelf when we're finished. It's going to be without plastic coverings. Everything else will pretty much go back the way it was. These paper coverings don't really do much in terms of keeping the moisture in. In fact, I think they almost lift up some of the moisture out of the material and then with their surface area allow it to more easily evaporate and dry off. Over here too, similar deal, not much different over on this side. Seeing more signs of these large leaves that were littering that other bin as well. They'll take time to break down, but this is a much younger bin, at least a couple weeks younger. So I think it'll have ample time to start, you know, breaking all that stuff down by the time we decide we're going to try gearing it up for harvesting. Okay, definitely large chunks of bedding and leaves and all kinds of stuff in here. Not sure what this is. This might be food already. This to me feels like a banana peel. So I think we're now starting to finally rummage around down here in the feeding area. So let's excavate the middle section, which is where we're going to add the food, and it's where the most previous feeding would have been placed. I'm curious to see how they did over the past 8 days with the portions that they were given last time. I had already seen some signs of it before when I was poking around. I could see some pretty good sized leftovers in here. It's a little bit surprising because this does seem like a fairly busy bin. So I'm seeing some leftover cantaloupe. The rinds, you know, I would say after 8 days you wouldn't really expect to see the rinds polished off yet, but the meaty section of the melon would be pretty heavily dented into. But you would definitely expect to see that the meaty portions of the melon are getting consumed, and they're working it down steadily. But there's still a little bit of leftovers remaining in here too. Sometimes I just wonder if that type of material is a little bit more resistant to breaking down, and then, you know, maybe it's just a couple more days before we really start to see some major activity on the cantaloupe. I believe I saw similar leftovers in another bin that I fed the other day. But other than that, I don't think we're seeing too many other bits and pieces of the previous feedings. Like this would be the stem of a banana peel. I think I saw some other bits of banana peel. We bumped into a few of them earlier. So things are looking pretty good in here. All these leftovers are not going to last much longer. The worms will just, you know, polish that stuff off, I'm sure, over the next week or so. And then during that time, while they're eating all that older material, the new stuff that we're putting in here now will have a chance to kind of, you know, decompose a little bit and get primed for worm ingestion. See a lot of worms hanging out down here underneath the feeding area. I did have a few of these coffee filters that I bought down here. I envisioned giving one to each container that we're feeding today, since I've got 3 of them. So we'll tear this paper up so that it can be used as bedding down here within the feeding area. I think this bin has fair bits of bedding everywhere, and if they want bedding they can come to the surface for it a little bit, even though it's a little bit dry. So I'm not going to go crazy adding bedding today. I think those few pieces of torn up coffee filter should be sufficient, and then we could start piling in some of this food that I bought down here for them. It's a whole variety of different stuff. Some of this was contributed by my mom. I brought it over from my mom's house yesterday, so a lot of these chopped up strawberry bits, I believe, came from there. These are plantains that kind of got lost in the refrigerator and did not look too good, so I put them in the freezer, but they didn't freeze. They're just kind of mushy still. It's surprising. I think we're going to save the rest for the other bins that we're feeding, because in here we've still got a little bit of coffee to toss in too. And then we'll top it off with these leftovers that we encountered on our way in. So I think waiting 8 days was just about right. We probably could have gone a little bit longer if we wanted to, but I'm always a fan of kind of coming in here even before the previous feeding has been completely depleted, so that I can, you know, put in the next batch of food and give that stuff a chance to start breaking down, so that the worms can, you know, make their way into that as well soon after they're finished polishing off the older stuff that's already had a good chance to break down. So let's make sure we've covered things up pretty good here, because, you know, with no plastic coverings, and then, you know, with stuff like cantaloupe and plantains and strawberries and all those scrumptious fruits, I'd rather not have all kinds of delicious things near the surface of this bin that any sort of gnats or flying insects or any sort of fruit flies or anything might be attracted to. I'll always feel better knowing that I've kind of buried my most recent feedings thoroughly before putting the system back up on the shelf to continue. And I think that's what we've achieved here. So this looks pretty good. And I think by giving everything a good hearty stir the way we just did, we're going to also help with the drying off process here too. Because what I brought up to the surface is a lot of the stuff that was really damp, that was down low. And a lot of that stuff that's had a chance over the past 8 days to dry off near the surface has been sunken down, which in itself will absorb some of the moisture in the process. So I think we're on the road to recovery here. I think things are looking pretty nice in this bin. So let's cover up and proceed to the next bin. Alright, so now this is not a very old bin at all, but it is heavy, I must say. And it's probably because it's got a lot of worms in it, and because it's got a lot of worms in it, I think it's got a good deal of weight as well. And I wouldn't be surprised if I were to decide that it was time to start winding things down in this bin, maybe even before one of the older bins that came before it. Just because of the number of worms in here, they're going to plow through anything I give them, and since I might even occasionally favor this bin by giving it a little bit extra food, by knowing that there's a large population in here, the overall weight of the bin and the contents of the bin are just going to keep piling up quicker and quicker. And as you can see, this is a slightly larger bin than the one we just checked in on. So all the bins that I'm using these days are a little bit smaller than this one, but I use this slightly larger sized bin for this one. And for that reason too, it's starting to pick up a lot of weight too by being pretty close to being full. So I've got to make a decision at some point that it's, you know, the bin's final feeding before I send it into that foraging, starving stage. And even though this is a slightly younger bin than the one we just checked in on, I'm almost thinking it might be ready for that stage. I mean, we'll give it a feeding today, but it may be the last feeding we give it for a while. This is the bin into which we had placed all of those leaves that I had collected too. So if we come down the middle over here and we start encountering a lot of large stems and leaves, that's going to be because this was where I had dumped all that stuff. And after 8 days, I would think we're probably going to bump into some of it as we make our way into the previous feeding area. But we'll get there when we get there. Let's, before we dive right down into the feeding area, we already took a peek in there a little bit. We probed into it a little bit, but I'd like to examine the outer edges of the bin first here, and then we'll open up a space to put the most recent feeding, possibly the last feeding for a while. Yeah, this bin is quite remarkable. As you look through here, it's just such nice material, very rich with castings, but it's still, you know, seriously littered with all kinds of scraps of food and bedding too. So it's a way away from being done. Here's a peach pit. I got a feeling that this is not going to make it to the finish line by the time this bin does, because this bin is just cooking. So yeah, you know, I'm very tempted to just maybe apply today's feeding into here and then wait to see how long it takes for this bin to end up with nothing in here but castings. Let it work through all of this scrap that we see in here, all these little bits of food. It's like the part of a mango shell. Here's some paper, lots of these leaf stems, which a lot of times these are my indicator of, you know, how we're doing. Once all that stuff starts to vanish, that tells me that the bin is really nearing its completion point. So things look really, really nice on this side. It's got a nice dampness level, but it's also extremely loose and breakaway and no clumpiness or muddiness. And you could tell from my glove too, it all just, you know, flakes right off my glove too. Okay, so let's also examine this far end of the bin. The outskirts of the bin on this side. Let's see how things look. Very similar story out here. Lots and lots of castings everywhere you look, but still also good signs of a lot of lingering bedding material, paper, even almost full tubes. Is that tubes? No, this might also be part of a mango seed. One that I had actually chopped into very small bits. So, you know, those things will all take time to break down, but the best way to focus the worm's attention to all that stuff is to, you know, suspend the feeding of fresh food and let them focus on all the old food that's already in there and all the old bedding bits and everything else. So what a nice bin. The material in here is so nice, and it's just humming along. And it's got such good weight to it too. That in itself just makes you kind of feel like, wow, I got a lot of castings piling up in here, and I got a lot of worms working on the job too. Here's an avocado pit. Oops. It's amazing too when, you know, you take an avocado seed out of an avocado. It's so tough, like a rock, but after it's been in the worm bin for a while, it'll just crumble in your fingers like that. So, very, very nice bin. Always a treat to work inside this bin, but let's get to the matter at hand. Let's get these guys fed. So I'm going to start excavating and opening over here down the middle where we could plop in today's feeding. And since the last feeding was placed down the middle and all the leaves and everything was placed down in the middle, we're probably going to see a good number of worms when we get down into the middle as well. And we've already seen a good number of worms regardless, but since that's where the food was placed, I would assume that that's where we're going to That's where we're going to find ourselves a good number of worms once we start pulling things back. Yeah. Here too, you can see some leftover cantaloupe. This was clearly a banana. It was just kind of maybe a half of a banana. And down here, under the feeding area, there's very little in here other than just worms. And here you can see a lot of the stems. These are the stems of those leaves that I placed in here. And they're huge, huge stems. They're going to need a little bit of time to break down. They've already chewed away all the leafy material off those leaves, but the stems are going to take a little bit longer to get broken down. So let's keep opening the space here. So we can make room for today's feeding. It's not that big of a feeding, so we don't need a lot of room, but I just enjoy plowing through the feeding zone of this bin to see how many worms this bin has, and I've gotten different estimates in here. My my spreadsheet has got to be wrong because it says 2,200 worms in here, and I've had people commenting in my comment sections of my videos from previous feedings suggesting that there's at least twice as many in here, you know, 4,000 or 5,000 or so. So take a little closer look at these guys. One of the people on one of the Facebook groups where I share my videos asked if I can get a closer look at these little guys, a little closer look at my red wigglers. So I figured I'd just hold them still in front of the camera for a moment or two there to let people get a closer look at them. There's a whole bunch of them here. Very nice. Last time I was in here, I had large quantities of this shredded paper that you see leftovers of here and there. And I was able to lay that all in here underneath the feeding as sort of the bedding underneath the food I was adding. But today I think we're just going to make do with one of these little coffee filters. And you know what? Maybe we'll just plop it in whole. How's that sound? We'll see how it holds up to a week's worth of activity in the worm bin. And let's see, where were these leftovers? Piece of melon rind. Oh, here's some more of that paper. Here's a banana stem. I thought there was another melon rind. I kind of lost track of it. If there was one, I've kind of misplaced it. Or I could just be misremembering. Who knows? We'll probably encounter it as we start covering things up over here. So yeah, what an awesome bin. Always fun to come into here and feed. So let's give these guys a nice hearty portion, but let's also leave some for the next bin that we're going to feed. So let's save a piece of plantain for those guys. Maybe half of this, I don't know what it is, maybe a mango or something. Okay, I think we've left enough to be generous with the next bin that we're going to feed. And I mean, tell you the truth, this is not a very hearty feeding at all. Not much at all. But then again, maybe this will be the last feeding for a while. In which case, we wouldn't want to overload it with food either, because we do at some point soon, we would want to see the worms focusing their attention more on all the leftover scraps in this bin. And kind of wean them off of fresh feedings and let them break down all the little particles that are scattered throughout the bin. There's another avocado seed. I got a feeling if I squash it, this one will probably break up pretty easily too. Maybe not quite as easily as the other one did, but I'm sure if we encounter it next time, it'll probably crumble. So yeah, what a really nice bin this is. Always such a treat coming in here. And I'm sure I probably spend way more time in here than I needed to. Get everything level for the most part. And we can get things covered up. Yeah, I think I was using a lot of that shredded paper as top covering in the bin, and then I had decided that it was time to use it as bedding. I think it's making much better progress down within the bin as bedding as opposed to just being top covering. So those other bins where we saw it out on top, or the other bin that we saw it out on top on, maybe at some point soon we'll start sinking all that shredded paper down into the bed so it can get some attention too and not just sit out on top as full sheets of shredded paper. Our little feeding zone indicator is getting torn up pretty nicely too, right? Worms come up for a little sip of water, take a little nibble off the feeding zone indicator coffee filter, and in time that eventually that's going to become just a scrap that's going to become bedding too that will just mix in with the rest of the container. It's kind of interesting too how they sort of nibbled away at this edge for whatever reason. I wonder why. Alrighty. Covering back up with the plastic. Oops. Trying not to scatter castings everywhere. Try to keep things somewhat neat and clean. And we can move on to the newest of my bins, which is only 13 days old at this point. So let's get that one out here. Alright, well, you know, I just realized as I was bringing this bin over and I looked over to the side, I can realize now that I totally forgot to add coffee to the last bin that we fed, and I totally forgot to add grit to the last bin that we just fed. I don't know why. I just get so sidetracked for some reason. We'll see how we do on this one. Maybe I can maintain enough focus to try to get the job done without missing steps. So things look pretty good in here. I was in this bin only yesterday, and the reason was that I had run a time-lapse video, and the time-lapse had come to its conclusion, and the bin's contents and the worms that were occupying it needed to be emptied out. So I used this bin as the repository for those worms and the material that was in that container. If you're interested in checking out that video, I'll put a video link up in the corner of the screen so you can click on that and go check out that time lapse in which those worms appeared. It's a cool video. Shows the worms over the course of 35 days, over 5 weeks, doing their thing. And this was just one of the pieces of paper that I had used when I was doing the movement of the worms out of that bin, and I used this to wipe with. So I think we'll just probably drop this piece of paper right down into the feeding area and use it as bedding underneath the food, along with the coffee filter that they're going to be getting as bedding. And I had really placed a lot of this paper on the top too to try to protect the top coverings from all this gooky material that came out of the time-lapse bin. But we'll actually turn this whole shebang around, get everything all mixed in. Unfortunately, a lot of these stagnant worms that you see out here on the surface that are not moving, a lot of these worms met their demise in that time-lapse bin, unfortunately. And it was one of the main reasons I really wanted to get that container unloaded. And there's even like that kind of smelly stink of dead worms. And it's the smell that you smell when you go into a bait shop. I never realized what that smell was when you go into a bait shop, and now I know. It's dead worms. So I think that this bin is going to benefit a lot from a little bit of agitation, kind of get all this stinky material off the top surface, sunken down, all the dead worms mixed in so that the other life forms within the bin can consume them and get their remains back into the circle of life. Because a dead worm within a worm bin usually gets consumed by all the other inhabitants of the bin within a couple days. That's one thing I've noticed in my time-lapse videos. As soon as a worm stops moving and it's and it has clearly met its demise. It soon thereafter gets consumed by all kinds of little creepy crawlies that inhabit the bin. They just all come right out of the woodwork and swarm around the worm carcass and gobble the whole thing up within a day or two. It's kind of interesting to watch. So I'm sure all these little dead worms that, you know, gave their lives for an interesting time-lapse video will do one final good by being the meal of some of the other creatures that inhabit this container. And obviously some of the creatures that inhabit this container are worms, but there's always other stuff in the worm bins too. There's mites, there's springtails, there's who knows what, all kinds of other little insects that make their way into a worm bin. So there's always a large abundance of little creatures in here helping to break all the stuff down that you keep piling in for them to break down, and it's like a little ecosystem. Okay, so I did not go down the middle yet. The middle is where the last feeding was applied. I just figured maybe I would try to scoop up some of this paperish type material and we could use it to sort of top cover with at the end. A lot of the material is just the material that the bin was originally built with, because the bin is only 13 days old, so it's not surprising that it's still got a great deal of the original bedding with which the bin was built. But it's also starting to exhibit, you know, some nice signs of, you know, castings piling up. So let's move down the middle, which is where the last feeding would have been applied not that long ago. I think it was 6 days ago that we last visited this bin and fed it. Those other two bins that we just got done feeding, they were last fed 8 days ago. This bin was last fed 6 days ago. Here we've got an avocado. The avocado was part of the last feeding. There was also a, what is this? Is this the pit from an avocado? Yeah. Except it's not cracked in half yet like you see sometimes. So it'll take time. It'll get there. There was a half of a cucumber, but I have a suspicion that that would probably be gone by now. Because, I mean, a cucumber is practically all water. And it's got a good, nice, sweet consistency too. But besides the half avocado, half cucumber, there was also this right here, which was the half of a tomato. And there's really not much left of this, and it's certainly a popular item. For some reason, I always thought that tomatoes were not really that good when it comes to worm composting. Something about it being a nightshade in the nightshade family, and that worms don't like nightshades or something like that. But every time I put tomatoes into the worm bin, man, the worms go crazy over it. So I'm not sure where I heard that, but whoever said it is clearly incorrect. Alright, very nice. Kind of glad to have all of that material that I dumped in here yesterday out of the time-lapse container kind of blended in, so that hopefully it can not smell of dead worm any longer. And we'll take this piece of paper that we had used as sort of a wiping rag at that time and use it as our bedding for this feeding. Nice generous portion of paper, even though there's obviously lots of it in here too. All these paper towel tubes and toilet paper tubes and all kinds of other shredded paper, everything in here. A bin that's still this young is always going to have a lot of the original materials still scattered throughout it, and that's what we're seeing in here. But that'll all change soon. So let's take the remains of the food that we bought down here and plop it in here. I think we got the majority of it, I believe. And here we've got more stuff that's compliments of my mom. This is parsley, Some more strawberry cuttings. This was the another piece of that mango I think we saw earlier that we decided we would try to share with this bin. And there's that piece of plantain as well. So it's a pretty good amount of food that we just tossed in here. And there was still a little bit of leftovers from the previous feedings as well. So we'll just get all this stuff centralized into the middle so we know where to find it next time we come back in here. But let's try not to overlook what we overlooked in the last bin, which is the application of grit and the application of some coffee. I thought I'd be using all of this up today, but maybe not. That's fine. We'll feed it to another bin in the near future. Alright, so this bin is going to be interesting to watch, because while most of my bins have only one breed of worm in them, you know, I'm either usually feeding a nightcrawler bin or a red wiggler bin. In this bin, I believe I've got a variety of 3 different types of worms occupying the space in here. And from what I understand, I believe it's red wigglers, European nightcrawlers, and blue worms. And if that's correct, then it should be a good team effort in breaking down the materials that get added to this bin. We'll have nightcrawlers probably work in the lower sections of the bin as it gets deeper. We'll have red wigglers focusing more on the surface, I believe. Blue worms are kind of new to me. This is the first container that I've got blue worms in. And I don't know too much about them yet, so I don't even know what their tendencies are. But I'll learn as time goes on. So I hope next time we come in here too that it doesn't have that putrid kind of dead worm smell like we're in a bait shop, because I don't like that smell. It's not a smell that I really experience very often. I mean, I've had problems before, and I've killed off populations of worms in places, and I've experienced that smell of worm carcasses rotting. And I'll warn you, if you haven't experienced it, it's not something you want to smell. It's pretty gross. Luckily, there's only a hint of it in here. It's not pungent. It's not stench. You know, it's not like in your face, but it's definitely here. It's present, and hopefully it won't be for very long. This feeding zone indicator is holding up pretty good, but you can see here too, it's getting nibbled on and consumed. So just a matter of time before the wormies break that up into little scraps too. So let's get everything put back the way we found it. And now we're done. I've probably taken a lot longer getting this job done than I anticipated. I didn't really expect to have 4 bins going all at the same time. So yeah, this might end up being a little bit of a longer video, so hopefully we don't lose you by this time. And I probably have lost a lot of you by this time, but if you're still here, that's awesome. And I thank you for that. So let me finish just by reiterating my thank you. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your company. And if you haven't done so already, give me a quick thumbs up. That's always really appreciated too. And also consider subscribing to the channel as well. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.